Being the last person is, well, it's an interesting challenge. Because you go, well, I was going to say that, and that, and that, and that, and I'll just say it my way. Like everyone else, I want to thank Clifton for putting this together. Thank everyone who's been involved in making this happen, especially behind the scenes. Your work is not unappreciated. And I am very thankful to God for the different gifts that we have seen in the various presenters. I sometimes say this, and I'll say this now for those who have rarely been up here, but may be up here in the future. This is important, I think, to think about. And it came up yesterday, but I want to add my voice to it, and that is, you've seen lots of styles of presentation, and you need to speak in your voice, in your personality, in your style. Because otherwise, you think you have to conform to what someone else is. All right, but you need to seek God and your community to be able to live into whatever your style is and whatever your voice is. I think that's very important because otherwise you think, well, if I didn't do this or if I didn't act like this, then, was I a loser or something? It's like, well, no. You were hopefully you're trying to you speak in integrity with the person that God made you to be. So I think that's very important to say as someone who's lived through that type of crisis. So in closing, I'm talking about the open vista of a Black public theology, which is, at least in part, for me, an exercise in thinking out loud. So I began to think about the open vista of a public Black theology when I encountered Vincent Lloyd's article. Since reading it, I've been considering the various dimensions involved in an attempt to answer the call for this kind of theology. While the focus of the article was on the search for Christian Black intellectuals, I found myself wondering about the range of people, including Black intellectuals, who might be reflecting on and participating in public Black theology. But before I talk about some of those people, I have to start with a prior question. And the prior question I find myself asking is, well, what is a public Black theology? Because what you'll discover is, as with the topic of this thing called political theology, public theology has a range of definitions. There is no magisterial definition of public Black theology, which I think is okay. So I'm going to join the party in offering another attempt, so we'll just call it a Bacotean public Black theology definition. So it's important to say at the beginning, I moved toward this by explicitly approaching this topic as a Christian, because there are some definitions of public theology itself that are not tradition specific. So I approach this as one inquiring about an aspect of lived Christianity. So in getting to that definition, I have to ask, well, what is meant by the word public? Also not something that has a magisterial definition. So for me, it's important to state that I'm one whose early Christian formation took place in church and parachurch contexts that either did not connect Christian faith to matters like culture or politics, or presented a tension with or dissonance between fidelity to God and engagement with things in the world. I believed there was a connection between Christian faithfulness and various forms of engagement with culture and politics, but had little more than an intuition to indicate that this connection was legitimate. It's from this background that I begin to think about the meaning of public. At the risk of being overly simplistic, I think of public as anything outside of our internal life, or as most of what we do in the time between the benediction at the end of corporate worship and the invocation 7 days later. The public realm includes, but is not limited to, politics, cultural life, and the world of work. Another way to think of it is as those matters not usually connected with a word like spiritual. Public refers to matters that we share with others, but also many domains that are outside the typical conception of church life. But what I mean by Black, there's been a lot of conversation about that. While this might seem quite obvious to some, this can also be at least a little bit complicated. The term Black may generally refer to persons of largely African descent, but part of the complexity comes when we think about the history and culture of the persons who use the term. It is a bit too easy to think it simply means all those who have African descent, because it does not mean the same thing to everyone. In fact, someone was indicating yesterday that there are people who don't want to use the term Black. For some, it's primarily a matter of describing a person's appearance, while for others it includes matters of biology, history, geography, culture, and much more. It is further complicated because of the context of white supremacy in the modern West and the related horrors of racialized societies. How does one think about a positive meaning for the word Black amid a modern West that constructed a modern fiction of racial identity? For certain, there are those who have seized the term and used it positively, but even this positive use exists under the cloud of a racialized world. Another consideration: what is one to make of the ways that some speak of Blackness as a kind of ontology? Whether they call it an ontology, they articulate it as if it is one. These are among the factors that make it difficult to easily define the term Black. Still, I have to make a choice if there's to be a definition of a public Black theology. Here's my proposal, and this is literally in the script, very subject to revision. So anyone who wants to help me revise it, that's cool. Black, here it comes, okay, it's really simple. Black is a less than ideal term that describes persons of sub-Saharan African descent by reference to their pigmentation. More particularly, it refers to those who live in the modern West and contend with the horrors and complexities of a racialized world constructed as part of the emergence of the modern era, in the broad general sense of the term modern. Well, what do I mean by theology? And then what is my definition of this thing for this open vista? As I mentioned earlier, I'm coming at this as a Christian, and therefore I'm referring to a Christian theology when I'm thinking about a definition. From that point of view, theology refers to the effort to understand the triune God and life with him by seeking to understand divine revelation in conversation with those who have come before me. In other words, traditions with an S on the end. Because, it'd be great to think I'm just making something up as I go along and other people never existed before me. But it's not just Jesus and me. So theology is not limited to, but includes branches such as historical, systematic, practical, constructive, womanist, etc. And it is not, to me this is very important, it is not severed from ethics. The reason I say that is because a lot of people live with a kind of assumption that there's biblical studies and theologies over here, and ethics is something that you tack on at the end. And for your perusal, I say, look at the curriculum of most seminaries, look at where ethics is connected to everything else. And you'll see that it's often just added on. I mean, how is it actually related to our biblical studies and our theology? What we understand, confess, and proclaim about God is connected to the way we conduct our lives. The way I thought about it was this way when I was in seminary. It just never made any sense to me that we talked about what we believed and then eventually you get around to how what you believe has something to do with the way that you live, which is kind of strange if you're thinking about a Jesus who says, follow me. So to do this well, it requires attention. To do this theology well requires attention to the context of Scripture, as well as the context of those involved in constructing and reconstructing what Christians confess and practice. So putting it all together, by public Black theology, or if you wish, Bacotean public Black theology. Bacotian. There you go. All right? You won't find it in the dictionary, believe me. By Bacotean public Black theology, I mean the pursuit of understanding life with God with particular reference to the domains of life beyond the benediction, with specific focus on the complex reality of Black life. This definition is not excluding matters typically associated with church, but gives primary attention to the lived realities that people bring with them when they participate in the church gathered for worship. For me, one of the key dimensions in this approach is the way we seek to connect Christian beliefs to the rest of life. How doctrines of creation, Christ, church, sanctification, pneumatology, eschatology, how these things connect to and inform our entire lived existence. And how might this occur in a way that is not arbitrary or ad hoc? To which I say this: I think it's really important that we think about this connection, because otherwise, a lot of people can talk about Jesus or church or being holy or whatever, but I often wonder how much of it is essentially like an exercise in proof texting. In other words, you've got a label. That label can be Jesus or church or holy or whatever. There's about this much of a content of what that word is, and then you connect it to whatever kind of public reality that you're talking about, which means you're saying more about the content of the public reality than about your belief informing that reality. So most of what it is then is the other reality being determinative than your theology having anything to actually inform it, rather than perhaps sponsoring it. So I sometimes ask my students, often ask my students, to think about their beliefs and how their beliefs are your beliefs saying more about what you are culturally, or your beliefs actually saying something about what God has revealed to us? And are you able to tell the difference? How do you know when you are speaking actually about what the faith says as opposed to what being a good American means? And we have to ask those kinds of questions. And so if we're going to connect our beliefs and do the work of connecting our beliefs to all these realities of life beyond Sunday, then it's important for us to actually know what we're talking about if we say Jesus, if we say church, if we say eschatology, etc. Otherwise, we're not really doing something that's theological. We're doing something that may be some other kind of discipline with a veneer of the theological. So the theological has to be there, in my view. So otherwise, I think it's just arbitrary, ad hoc. It's kind of like a buffet-style approach to things. You kind of take a little of this, mix it with a little of that, and you just put it out there. So that's my Bacotean thing. All right. So who's involved in all this? So this goes back to the people I was talking about that first came to my mind at the beginning. Who are those coming to the table to discuss public Black theology? Come whosoever wills is what I would like to say, but I need to be more specific. When I first read Vincent Lloyd's article, here's what started percolating in my mind. I began to think about the fact that, at least in the United States, pastors and academics rarely occupy the same conversational spaces. And that theological conservatives and theological progressives, whether pastors or academics, also rarely converse with each other. There are certainly those who do not easily fit into these categories. So I have, if there's an objection that's happening in your mind, objection noted. But Generally, even those people have a consistent set of conversation partners on these issues. And of course, there are people who mainly traffic within their denominational circles. Members of these different groups, at least some of the members of these groups, okay, share common concerns about various aspects of African American public life, but they rarely venture to other conversational spaces. As we're doing at this conference, I would like to see people from these different groups come together in an, and this is really important, irenic conversational space where they hear each other speak about the ways they have been approaching public concerns. This is not an environment focused on arriving at a consensus or even having lots of agreement. I mean, if you want to turn it into a debate, you can call it a debate and make it that kind of thing. I'm not talking about a debate. I'm talking about people getting together and listening to each other. At least at the beginning, it's more about discovering that there are compatriots you have never known and learning about and from each other. It fascinates me to think about what will be held in common and what will be very different. One difficulty with what percolated in my mind is that I only mentioned people of a certain profile, and it can seem like an exercise in elitism. It is important to find ways to include interested lay voices from across the generations. My dream scenario is conversations that provide exposure to the diversity of educational and denominational backgrounds, as well as the different personal experiences and range of public priorities. At most, such conversations create new networks and help facilitate practices of Christian life that connect to the public domain in a variety of ways. Well, if we're getting together to do this, what do we talk about? What are we doing? In the open vista of public Black theology, the vista is immense. For certain, a public Black theology must contend with the past legacy and present reality of a racialized world that mutates like a stubborn virus. I like to say that because even when you think you've begun to come up with some kind of solution, it's like a virus that keeps changing. You think, now this shot will do it, you see. Well, by the time you've developed like that shot, you've had the mutation take place. And then you're like, why isn't it working? Because it's mutated. And that's what it keeps on doing. Modern society has the DNA of white supremacy built into it. We've said that a lot. But this should surprise no one. And by the way, if you're dealing with people who, when you say the word white supremacy, you discover that they're on the ledge, right? Or they're on the precipice, or they're about to, they've got a shield at their side that they're about to put up their wall so there's no conversation. This is one of the ways that I try to talk them off the ledge or to keep them from reaching for the shield. All right, so I just asked them to think about this. I asked them, who built the modern world? All right, well, Europeans built the modern world. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. Then I asked them, who do you think they built it for? And if somebody else built it, who do you think they would build it for? It should surprise nobody that if somebody builds a world, they build it with their interests in mind. And we like to believe, there's like this mythology about the Enlightenment. Oh, everybody's rational, and and we're objective. And then, of course, somehow in these rational, objective people, of course, really thought that all human beings were just equal people, which, of course, is not what they thought. They didn't even think that of all Europeans. And if you just want some proof, just read Immanuel Kant talking about people of a darker hue, and you'll see how objective he was, or not, right? So when we help people, before they reach for the shield, just ask them to do a little thought experiment, all right? And then they're like, oh, okay. So then, they might grab the shield later, okay? But you might begin the conversation, and they might actually stay in the conversation if you ask them that question. Because then they have to really think about, what is this world? How did it get here? Who built it? Oh, yeah. I shouldn't be surprised about white supremacy then. It just comes with the territory. So in this modern world built by Europeans, hardly anything is untouched in this modern racialized world. So it's going to at least be the backdrop for any issue that we discuss if you're talking about a public Black theology. That said, there are topics of discussion that are not exclusively about questions connected to racial oppression and merit attention as well. With this vast open vista, comprehensiveness is elusive. I make no claims of comprehensiveness, but I do want to offer a few things to consider as discussion topics in the vista of public Black theology. I begin by talking about one way of thinking about holistic discipleship in the church. I mean, you've been hearing it already this morning. Okay, so I'm just adding my voice to what has been said. So it's important to begin by thinking about modes of Christian formation, not only in terms of structure, in light of cultural changes, but also the breadth of content. While it's likely I speak to a room of people who are convinced that we need a public Black theology, my assumption, if you're here, is that you're at least somewhat convinced that public Black theology isn't something you're like, well, what is that? And why do we need to talk about it? You at least think, okay, I'm on board. Okay, great for people in the room. That's not every Christian in the world. Right. So, while I speak to the convinced, I would wager that each of us in this room knows people in our churches or other Christian networks who are not sure that some of these matters of public concern are properly spiritual issues and may in fact be a distraction from the best kind of fidelity to God. Some of you may even know those who think all of this is just too worldly, in which case their formation has framed Christian life as disconnected from most of their everyday life, except when God needs to show up in times of crisis. A modified catechesis, even if your church doesn't use the word, okay, teaching, there we go. A modified catechesis is necessary in order to broaden the view of discipleship so that it is truly holistic and extends to the entirety of our existence. Here's one way I try to do it. By asking people to think about the relationship between the incarnation and life in God's world, particularly when people have a tendency to believe that salvation is a rescue from creation rather than a reclaiming of creation. I ask them if they take Christmas and Easter seriously, where we celebrate Jesus being born as a baby in December and we rejoice in his resurrection in a body in April. If we do, we cannot for a moment believe that salvation means the abandonment of the particulars of life. Why is Jesus coming in a body? If humans are the crown of creation, human beings embodied, and Jesus comes and takes on a body, and he lives a perfect life, and he dies, and he's resurrected in a body. He's not a sophisticated hologram. If he's in a body, what does that tell you about what God thinks about his creation? And if it's his creation, why would discipleship have nothing to do with most of it? That's just kind of a strange thing to me. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Unless you think being a Christian means being an agnostic or being docetic in your Christology. So that's one way that I think about doing it. Perhaps an experiment in our various traditions is to identify the doctrines and the spiritual vocabulary that are central to the denomination or local church and help people to see how that language and doctrine actually orients us toward domains of life not typically thought of as spiritual. So chances are, in whatever circles you run, there are phrases that show up all the time. So how do those phrases actually connect to what we do in our lives when we're outside church, when we're outside those contexts? I think that is a creative and imaginative project in which we can participate and get people to see that what they've been talking about all the time actually does not take them away from life in God's world, but really thrust them toward it. So those are just a couple of suggestions as part of an aspiration toward an expanded Christian formation that will make public Black theology part of what we do when we make disciples and do church. One of our goals should be doing our best to avoid making those who care about public Black theology a theological special interest group. So in addition, this type of broader formation can help provide ways for laypersons to see their work lives as part of their discipleship and to see themselves as those who can be formative within their workplaces, from the corner office to the factory floor to the janitorial closet. That is really important because a lot of times when we complain about things that go wrong in the world, and there are people in our churches who work in those domains, ask them how their faith informs what they do in that work world where they spend all those hours there besides praying, which is wonderful. I mean, prayer is important, okay? So, I'm on camera. Gosh, if you're looking at me, prayer is important, okay? Prayer is important. Bible studies are important. Evangelism is important. Those aren't the only things that Christians do. But if that's all that they know, then all they are doing then is just conforming themselves to whatever the status quo is in those domains. And their churches are not telling them that their participation in those domains are opportunities for them to become the ones that are formative in those domains, rather than those who just get on the rails and just go to wherever the tracks take you, instead of being the ones that, hey, I'm building some new rails here. I'm setting a new direction here. I'm creating a new culture here, instead of just being those really good at the status quo. I think that is very important. And I think within our churches, people need permission from their clergy, and it's part of their formation to recognize, oh, you mean I can think about this stuff? I can care about this stuff? God cares about this stuff? So I think that it's very important for us to do that as part of the formation. It's just baked into it. A few more issues. The issue of identity, which has come up in various ways. So many people of all kinds live under a reign of terror when it comes to questions of identity. I mean, that's no matter what you are. And a racialized world makes us even more messy and complicated. It is vital to answer the questions, who am I? Who are we? Am I worth something? These questions are not simply an internal exercise because the public realm is a vital element in our identity formation. Think of all the things that wash over us every day that inform people's identities, actively and passively. And ask yourself in this social media world about the kind of curated selves that people have, right? So people on Instagram accounts, how many people show everything about their lives in social media as opposed to a curated life, right? So you look at how pristine my life is, right? Which of course creates all kinds of dissonance for people. Well, my life's not quite that pristine. Oh my, right? So those types of things, right? Those things are having a tremendous impact on people's identity formation. For those of African descent who live in the large wake of a racialized society, the question of identity has been part of a quest for survival in an environment of active dehumanization. And while some have felt this more than others, the impact is on all of us. I have one proposal in the midst of that when we think about surviving and reversing that dehumanization. And that is stepping away from the temptation of an identity competition. The goal in discovering and growing into our identity is not well served if we feel we must replace white supremacy with black supremacy. To do so is only to replace one idol with another. We can fervently pursue a life-giving identity without the need to conquer others. Our goal is humanization, in which case we should model a pursuit of identity that is rooted in the deep truths of our faith, along with appreciation of the healthy trajectories that make us, us. I had initially put all trajectories, and then I thought about the fact that that's a bad idea, because there are trajectories that make us us that are not good ones. Right. You want to close off those trajectories, right? You want to get you don't want those to be making you who you are, because some of those are very dehumanizing, very deformative for people. Part of the reason why I think about this identity competition thing is that this strange thing happens, right? You feel like you're in an arms race for identity because of white supremacy. So okay, let's shore up who we are. And the shore up who we are, it can just creep in. So when I show how superior we are, then we're okay. Okay, so we're superior. Okay, black people. Okay, so we're over whites. Okay, and all the non-white people in the world, and there are a lot of them. What about them? Right? I mean, we're not the only people in the world. So I think resisting the idolatry is really important, because what we really want is humanization for all people, not just our own humanization. So that's why I think we have to be leery of that, be wary of the temptation with that. So that's a little bit about identity. I see what the clock is telling me. All right, there's only 3 more things. I'll be brief, in spite of what my brother probably would say. Because he would say, you can never do it, Vincent. Related to identity, something I heard about in NPR the other day, and that's something related to the issue of adoption. They produced a program of children who are transracial adoptees. The stories are many, and there are tremendous challenges involved and no easy answers. Children need safe and loving parents. But this is a difficult path for parent and child alike. I recently spoke with a woman who's white, and she has an adopted son from Ethiopia. And there's a phrase she said that was really interesting. She said, all adoption is loss in some way. An article I read by a transracial adoptee, a black woman, disclosed her pain, such as when she was growing up and trying to make sense of why she looked as she did, knowing she looked different from her adoptive parents. The issue of children who need adoption, and we should also include foster children in this, is a major public concern. Right? It's a public good to take care of your children. How do our approaches to public black theology help inform us and cultivate strategies for this circumstance where human flourishing is a challenge, even amid beautiful kaleidoscopic family photos full of smiles? Of course, public theology is unavoidably political, so politics is, of course, a topic. And again, while in this room we are the convinced, I wonder how many of us know of churches or people in churches or attend churches where the political is off limits from the pulpit. Now, there's an example of where this is opposite, which occurred this week. Some of you may have heard that the Progressive National Baptist Convention issued a statement this week, which says the following. As the home of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the PNBC is compelled to step forward amidst the worsening crisis at the heart of American life to reaffirm the commitment of the Church of Jesus Christ to truth and justice. PNBC is sounding a clear alarm in a moment of spiritual and cultural confusion and pointing the way toward the redemption of this trying hour. The blatant moral hypocrisy and rancid theological heresy of the so-called Christian right have transformed the current political and cultural crisis into a deeper spiritual catastrophe. The skewed perception of the Christian faith in the press, encouraged by a liberal Enlightenment bias against religion, which consistently identifies it with the most vociferously ignorant and reactionary elements in public life, has led to a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between Christian faith and the public square. Through the alchemy of media shorthand, the white and often racist conservative evangelical movement gets identified with the Christian faith, while the black church's witness is reduced to civil rights light, L-I-T-E. This misplaced emphasis has effectively silenced the most authentic expression of Christian faith in the modern world, as it is subsumed under the headings of either the conservative evangelical right or the liberal left. But it has always been the African-American church that has led the way forward along the moral arc of American history. I know some people may have questions about that particular denomination. That's fine. I'm just reading the statement, okay? PNBC is explicitly and intentionally enjoying the conversation as the alternative, yet the most authentic Christian voice in this critical hour. PNBC will continue efforts to raise the visibility of the Black church as a voice to be acknowledged and recognized as germane to all conversations relative to the Christian faith in America. So one of the people who was speaking on that behalf was Reverend Calvin Butts of Abyssinian Baptist Church. And a specific thing he talked about was the declaration will lead to other steps, including the Black church support or personal withdrawing of money from banks such as Wells Fargo for their role in the subprime mortgage crisis that has disproportionately affected minority owners. He said, as we always remember that when this economy booms, it is usually at the exploitation of Black and brown people. It's also important to note that while it was a PNBC announcement, others attending the declaration included representatives from the Church of God in Christ, the Interfaith Alliance, the National African American Clergy Network, and the Ecumenical Poverty Initiative. So that's an example of at least a statement that's being made by churches about this. Again, I think the question we have to ask is, in terms of where we are and in the circles that we're in, how much are people actually willing to talk about these things? And is there any way you can connect what's going on in the pulpit and in Christian formation to these types of things? I think you can, but I think a way to get the skeptical convinced is for them to see how political commitments are things that flow out of particular texts that are being preached. That help them to see it's sort of commonsensical. For example, if you preach about two greatest commandments and you're talking about love your neighbor as yourself, and you're asking about what are all the ways we can contribute to people loving our neighbors as ourselves? Avoiding politics is not one of those ways. And I mean, however you would do it, but that's a way of thinking about that. So I think that's a way to think about it. Another dimension I want to talk about in relationship to politics is the fact that when we think about political life, we need to reckon with the fact that there are all kinds of people in our churches, which means that they'll have different kinds of things that they can do well and some things they probably just won't do, by which I mean this. So some people are just born prophetic types and activists. It's just who they are. Okay, don't try to convince them to not be those people. I mean, that's just like, I'm going to muzzle you. Okay, it's who they are. I mean, it's like breathing for them, okay? Other people would rather die than protest. There's no question about it. I mean, you've met them, I'm sure. So, and my point is this. My point is not that it's choosing between activism or something else. The point is that there's, just in Christianity, we talk about a diversity of gifts in the body. There's diversity of things to be done. We need people who are activist types to be out there pointing at things that are going wrong. And in a country like this one where, it's an expression of free speech, to take advantage of the expression of free speech in the various ways that they go about doing their activism. But it's also important, I think, to say about activists is that while they're investing the time in that, generally, they don't have time to make public policy. And you need to make public policy. So we need other people who love the intricacy of details and the elegance of, it's like people who love being accountants. I mean, this is not disparaging those people, okay? Let me just point that out. But they're very behind the scenes, detail-oriented people who love to build these things, but you may never see their face. But they're absolutely vital. Because without the people making public policy, activism will just be a lot of exhaustion. Because we're talking about things, well, still things have to get implemented. And at least in this country, where when you're a citizen, you can influence the way things go in society, then, you can participate in the formation of public policy. So we need to encourage just as much people being involved in the intricate details that are often boring and mundane for some people, to be involved in that as much as we need people being activists. We need all hands on deck. And we also need to encourage everyone to vote. Here's another reason why we have the presidency that we have. 40% of the population didn't vote in the last election. Okay, so that's also part of what you have to think about. 40%, that's almost half the population. Ask people in your congregation, why didn't they vote? And at least say this to people. I mean, pastors can do this. You can say to the people in your congregation who didn't vote, because you didn't vote, you have forfeited complaining for 4 years. Because when you forfeit political activity, you say to other people, I'm fine with what you're doing with political activity. And for all the messiness of the world that we live in the United States, you at least, if you're a citizen of the United States, you still have political agency. And it's tough, it's hard, but it's agency that can actually make something, you can move the needle a little bit, and sometimes a lot. But if you're saying, who cares, then please don't say anything except I'm going to watch. Don't complain because you've told other people, no, you go ahead. So it's important, vote, be involved, write to your congressman, all those things. It's important. So I think that those are important dimensions of political life to talk about. And a way of thinking about it, if you want to connect it to what we believe is, do you believe that Christians are followers of Jesus who need to love their neighbors as themselves? If you do, and you're in a country where one of the ways you can do that is by political participation, then are you going to avail yourself of doing that? That's important. So that's politics. So I'm going to note these topics and say nothing about them and then close. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I'll note 2, say something about 1, and then close. Talking about education is very important because that's vital to the ways of people being able to participate in our society in its imperfection. But we have not solved anywhere near the problem with things like public education. And then I'm going to go to this topic: public health. That's also a public concern. So it has to do with, and that's also actually related to things like economic life, what kinds of stores are available in neighborhoods? How much access do people have to health care? How much access do they have to the kinds of foods that they can eat so that they're eating more healthy as opposed to foods that are going to contribute to them, just being more, another statistic in the way that diabetes has made a huge comeback. That's a major public concern, as is mental health as part of public health. So here is a graph I have. I have to look at my phone to tell you who the source is because it's not on the graph. And I was advised by a good friend to make sure I told you who the source was for this. So I'm going to tell you who the source is on my phone before I read these statistics. All right, Mental Health America is the source. So here's what they say. 13.2% of the U.S. population identifies as Black or African American. Of those, over 16% had a diagnosable mental illness in the past year. The raw number of that is over 6.8 million people, which is more than the populations of Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia combined. And people have been talking about this, but only about a quarter of African Americans seek mental health compared to 40% of whites. Some of the reasons why: distrust, misdiagnosis, socioeconomic factors, lack of access to insurance. And of course, one of the challenges is, can you, if you're in a church, talk about depression? Can you talk about suicidal thoughts? And if you do, will someone actually be willing to say, we need to take you to a specialist? I'm not saying don't pray for them. Look, I believe in miracles. But, Paul didn't tell Luke, stop being a physician, right? It's like, Luke, you're now a scribe. You're no longer a physician. We don't read that anywhere, right? So Luke's still Luke, the physician. So we need to take seriously the medical world, especially mental health. All right, very last thing, which is, I'm just going to be very brief about this, a healthy pursuit of justice, by which I mean, one of the potential hazards of pursuing justice, of engaging public concerns, especially as you're thinking about it in a racialized world, is one, you can be overwhelmed by just looking at the horror. I've said it in other places, I'll say it again. I'm very thankful that somebody did the series Eyes on the Prize. I don't usually watch it because it's hard to watch. Because, look, there's kind of an achievement at the end. Okay, what do you have to do? Be exposed to get to that part? It's tough. And I'm not saying don't ever look at it. I'm not talking about denial, but I'm reckoning with the fact that, it's like when Brian Stevens says we haven't really faced our history. When you face it, you are facing horror. Whatever horror, and if there are horror movie aficionados in here, you like horror movies, you won't like this one. You will not like this one. It will overwhelm you. It will devastate you. And there's only so much devastation that people can take. And so I think we have to make sure that people are being cared for when we're asking them to do this and to look at this. And also when people are dealing with, when people are having their conscience raised by issues of oppression and justice, sometimes they get angry. Anger is appropriate. Being consumed by your anger is not. You do not need to be burned up by the fire of your anger in order to pursue justice. That is an unnecessary sacrifice. And we need to make sure that when people are pursuing justice, that they are being cared for, because otherwise you have what I think is part of what we have at the present, which is a pastoral emergency that happens in a social media society when people get exposed to all the things that are happening about race. And of course, you get more and more and more stuff all the time because we're in a 24/7 news cycle and people get hit and hit and hit and hit and hit and hit and hit. And you see people being outraged about the justice, but you can also see that they are being harmed just by their exposure to it all. That is a pastoral emergency. Right. That is a public issue. So I think it is important for us to think about a healthy pursuit of justice as part of also what is out there on the Vista. There are many other things, and I'm over time, so I will close by saying this. The Vista is wide, the opportunity is immense, and the privilege is ours. Let us do more than survey the Vista. Let us head into it full of faith and strong in hope in our God, who is greater than the most daunting challenges. Thank you.